Welcome to our deep dive. And wow, you weren't kidding about wanting to dig into productivity.
Yeah, you've given us quite the stack of research here.
It is a lot, isn't it? We've got articles and book excerpts and even some scientific studies.
Not to mention those fascinating case studies you mentioned.
Oh, right. Like how Disney animators come up with new ideas.
And how poker champions make those high-stakes decisions.
Yeah, and even some insights into how the Marine Corps operates.
That's quite a range, isn't it?
Definitely.
Yeah.
It seems like we're after a pretty holistic view of what makes people and teams tick.
You could say that I think the goal here is to uncover those surprising truths
About,
about what really fuels motivation and focus.
oh, and how people make smart choices.
And I'd say we're not looking for typical productivity hacks, are we?
Not at all. We're going for the aha moments,
The ones that make you rethink your entire approach.
Exactly. We want to go deeper than just surface level tips and tricks.
More into the underlying mechanisms, right?
Yeah, the why behind effective action.
I think you summed it up perfectly.
Okay, so to kick things off, let's dive into motivation.
Sounds good.
One of the most interesting stories I found was about this entrepreneur, Robert.
Uh-huh.
He was super successful and driven,
The type who never stopped.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then one day, poof, his motivation vanished.
That's a pretty dramatic shift.
It really was. It happened so suddenly, like someone flipped a switch.
When was this?
Well, he and his wife Viola were on vacation in Bolivia.
Okay.
And when they landed in La Paz, Rob started acting really strange.
I've heard that the altitude there can mess with you.
Yeah, but this was more than altitude sickness. He was stumbling and rambling, even throwing money at children.
Oh, wow. So his personality totally changed?
A total of 180. And it didn't go back to normal when they got home either.
So what happened?
He became totally apathetic, lost interest in his hobbies, and stopped caring about work.
Even though he knew he had things to do.
Exactly. It was like all that drive he was known for had disappeared.
I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for him.
And for his wife, Viola, she was incredibly driven herself, always running their household with goals and charts and everything.
So very organized.
Yeah. But seeing Robert lose that spark really got to her, too.
I bet she was probably worried about him.
Definitely. But it also made her feel like she lost control over her own life.
So it affected them both really deeply.
It did. And it turns out there was a physiological reason for this change.
Really?
Yeah. A neurologist found that he'd had a small brain hemorrhage during that trip to Bolivia.
During the trip?
Uh-huh. Specifically in a part of the brain called the striatum.
What's the striatum?
It's basically the brain's motivation center.
Interesting. So is that why he lost his motivation?
That's what the research suggests. Studies have shown that the striatum actually lights up when we make choices.
Even small choices.
Even small ones. It's all about feeling in control.
So it's not just about setting goals, but about feeling a sense of agency and pursuing those goals.
Exactly. And people with damage to their striatum, like Robert, often lose that drive to act.
Even if they understand the benefits.
Right. Which brings up a really interesting question.
What's that?
If choice is so crucial for motivation,
Uh-huh.
what about environments where people have limited autonomy? Like,
Where?
well, the military, for example.
That's a good point. They have to follow orders constantly.
Right. So how do they cultivate motivation in such a seemingly restrictive setting?
Yeah, you'd think it'd be like the worst place to foster motivation.
You would.
Oh, yeah.
But the research actually gave a really cool example from Marine Corps boot camp.
Oh, really?
What was it?
Well, they take these unmotivated teenagers and turn them into disciplined Marines in just a few weeks.
How do they do that?
Part of it is by cleverly using choice to build a sense of control.
But how do they do that when everything's so regimented?
Well, the research described this obstacle course challenge
Uh-huh.
where recruits have to work together to get their team across this big pit.
Using what?
Just planks and ropes.
Sounds tricky.
It is. But there's a catch. They're all wearing gas masks.
So they can't talk. Exactly. So they can't hear their leader giving direct orders.
So how do they know what to do?
They have to figure it out themselves.
Ah, so they have to problem solve on the fly.
Right. They have to take ownership of the challenge and make decisions that aren't spelled out for them.
Wow. That's pretty ingenious. It forces them to think for themselves.
And to adapt to unexpected situations.
Exactly. And in that moment, they're not just following orders, they're leading.
And that feeling of leadership can be really motivating.
Even if it's just for a small task.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It shows that even in restrictive environments, there are ways to design for choice.
And to empower individuals.
Right. And that applies to all of us, even in our everyday lives.
How so?
Well, it's about finding those workarounds, like you said, even in our everyday tasks.
So even small things can make a difference.
They can. if we connect them to our bigger goals and values.
So we're making meaningful choices, not just going through the motions.
Exactly. And even a little bit of that feeling of control can go a long way.
That's a powerful reminder.
Okay, so we've explored what happens when motivation goes missing.
Right.
But what about when it's amplified in a team setting?
You mean how to create those high-performing teams that just seem to click?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what we'll unpack next. We were just talking about how important that sense of control is for individual motivation.
Right.
But how does that translate to a team setting,
How to get a group of people all working together effectively.
Especially high achievers.
Mm-hmm.
You'd think they'd butt heads all the time.
Yeah, you'd
Yeah.
expect a clash of egos, for sure.
Right, because they're all used to being the smartest one in the room.
Exactly.
One of the studies you shared looked at this woman named Julia.
Uh-huh.
She was part of a case competition team at Yale.
Those are pretty intense.
Oh, yeah. They attract some serious type A personalities.
So I imagine there's a lot of pressure to perform.
Definitely. But that's not what happened with Julia's team.
Really?
She said it was actually really energizing.
How so?
Well, they all bounced ideas off each other and gave each other constructive criticism.
Yeah.
So they weren't afraid to challenge each other.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And no one was afraid to let someone else take the lead when it made sense.
So it sounds like they had a good balance of collaboration and healthy competition.
They did. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
Think about the original Saturday Night Live team.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Yeah, they were known for their behind-the-scenes drama, weren't they?
totally. They were always fighting and undermining each other.
But they also produced some of the most iconic comedy ever.
Exactly. So how could a team that was so dysfunctional be so successful?
That's a good question. It seems like a contradiction.
It does. But the research pointed to psychological safety as the key ingredient.
Interesting. So even though they were constantly challenging each other, they still felt safe to speak their mind.
Right. They knew they wouldn't be ridiculed or dismissed, even if their ideas were bad.
And Lorne Michaels really fostered that environment, didn't he?
He did. He made sure everyone felt heard, even if their sketch idea was terrible.
Even if it was a total flop.
He'd still have it read multiple times, just to make the writer feel valued.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. It shows how much he cared about creating a supportive environment.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about giving everyone a voice. It was about valuing those contributions.
So that sense of security allowed them to be more creative.
Exactly. Because they knew they could take risks without fear of judgment.
That makes sense. When people feel safe to be vulnerable, they're more likely to share their best ideas.
Right. And to engage in honest, productive debate.
So it wasn't the absence of conflict that made them successful, but rather their ability to navigate it constructively.
Exactly. It was about channeling those strong personalities into a collective force.
I like that, a collective force.
And that's what creates true team intelligence.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so we've seen what can happen when motivation is absent
Right, like with Robert.
and when it's firing on all cylinders in a team.
Like with Julia and the SNL crew.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about focus.
Okay.
Or rather, what happens when our focus gets hijacked.
You mean like distractions?
Well, yeah, but I'm talking about something even more insidious. This concept called cognitive tunneling.
Cognitive tunneling.
Yeah, the more I read about it, the more it freaked me out.
Why is that?
Well, it's this phenomenon where we get so fixated on a particular task or piece of information
Okay.
that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
So we're kind of stuck in this mental tunnel.
Exactly. And it can have some pretty disastrous consequences.
Like what?
Well, one of the scariest examples is the story of Air France Flight 447.
What happened?
It was flying from Rio to Paris on autopilot
Okay.
when ice crystals blocked the speed sensors.
So they couldn't tell how fast they were going.
Right. And suddenly the pilots were bombarded with all these conflicting alarms and data.
That sounds overwhelming.
It was.
Yeah.
And they became so focused on trying to make sense of their instrument panels
Uh-huh.
that they completely missed the basic signs that the plane was stalling.
They were so focused on the details that they missed the big picture?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were in this cognitive tunnel, unable to step back and see what was really happening.
And what happened to the plane?
It crashed into the ocean,
Oh,
killing everyone on board.
that's awful.
It is. And it's a really stark reminder that focus by itself isn't enough.
It has to be directed appropriately.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we avoid falling into that tunnel vision trap?
Yeah, that's a good question. Especially in high-pressure situations.
Well, that's where mental models come in.
Okay.
The research contrasted the Air France disaster with another flight, Qantas Flight 32.
Uh-huh. What happened on that flight?
This one also had a major malfunction. An engine exploded shortly after takeoff,
Oh, wow.
but the outcome was totally different.
What happened?
The captain of the Qantas flight had drilled his crew on different emergency scenarios beforehand.
So they were prepared.
They were. He'd essentially told them stories about what could happen and how they should respond.
So they had a plan.
Exactly. And when that engine exploded, they didn't panic.
They knew what to do.
They did. They stayed calm, drew on those pre-built mental models, and landed the plane safely.
That's incredible. So they averted a catastrophe because they had a mental map to guide them.
Exactly. They knew where to focus their attention, and they anticipated potential problems.
This really highlights the power of proactive thinking, doesn't it?
It does. Instead of just reacting to events as they unfold.
We can prepare ourselves to navigate challenges by constructing these mental models in advance.
Right. It's like having a set of pre-programmed responses.
That allow us to act quickly and decisively even when the unexpected happens.
It's like building a mental simulator for your life.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
You run through different scenarios in your head.
Uh-huh. And figure out how you'd respond if they actually happened.
That way, when you face those challenges in real life,
You're not starting from scratch.
you've already done the heavy lifting of thinking through the possibilities.
Exactly. So the takeaway here is don't wait for a crisis to hit.
Right.
Think about what you expect to happen in different situations.
Both good and bad.
Exactly. Yeah. Tell yourself stories about potential obstacles and how you'll overcome them.
It's like creating a mental map to guide you through complexity.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that can make all the difference.
Okay, so we've talked about choice for motivation
Right.
and psychological safety in teams.
Ah.
And now, mental models to guide our focus.
What's next?
Well, let's explore how to become better decision makers,
Even when the stakes are high.
especially when the stakes are high and the information is incomplete.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It can be. But there are ways to improve our odds. And for this, we're going to turn to the world of professional poker.
So we were just talking about mental models and how they can help us,
Stay focused and make better decisions even when things get tough.
right. But when it comes to making those really tough calls,
Especially when we don't have all the information.
exactly, there's another skill that comes in handy.
And what's that?
Probabilistic thinking.
Using probabilities to guide our decisions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the best examples I found was this professional poker player, Duhigg.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of her. She's won a ton of money, hasn't she?
Millions. And she even has a World Series of poker bracelet.
Wow. So she's definitely the real deal.
She is. But what's really interesting is how she approaches the game.
What do you mean?
Well, she doesn't just go with her gut or anything.
So it's not just about intuition.
Not at all. She uses probabilistic thinking to make calculated decisions.
Even when the pressure's on.
Exactly. The article described this one hand she played,
Uh-huh.
where she had a really strong hand, a pair of tens.
Okay.
But she was facing a huge bet from this guy called the Fossil Man.
That's a pretty intimidating name.
It is.
Huh.
And she had to decide whether to risk it all or fold.
So what does she do?
She thought about her opponent's betting patterns, the cards on the table, all factors,
Yeah.
and ultimately she decided to fold.
Yeah.
The Fossil Man was bluffing. He didn't even have a decent hand.
So she made the right call.
She did, but she still lost the hand.
How's that possible?
Because that's the thing about probabilistic thinking.
It's not about being right all the time.
Exactly. It's about making decisions that have the highest likelihood of success over the long term.
So you're playing the odds.
Exactly. Even if it means losing sometimes.
Because sometimes even the bad decisions don't work out.
Right. There are always factors outside our control.
So it's a mindset shift, really.
It is. We have to let go of the need to be right all the time,
And focus on making decisions that are statistically sound.
even if they don't always feel good in the moment.
Exactly.
The research also pointed out that we humans are actually pretty good at predicting things,
Like what?
like lifespans or movie box office totals.
Mm-hmm.
But there's catch.
What's that?
We need to expose ourselves to a full range of outcomes.
Not just the successes.
Right. If we only focus on the positive.
We get a skewed view of reality.
Exactly. And that can lead to some bad decisions.
So how do we avoid that?
Well, the research mentioned that successful entrepreneurs actually seek out people who will tell them about their failures.
Really?
Yeah, they want to hear the hard stories, the ones that don't make it into the magazines.
So they can learn from other people's mistakes.
Exactly. And avoid that survivorship bias.
It makes a lot of sense.
It's about actively seeking out diverse perspectives and information.
Even if it's uncomfortable.
Right. Because it helps us calibrate our mental models to reflect the full spectrum of reality.
Not just the highlights.
So the key takeaway here is to actively seek out a diversity of experiences.
Both good and bad.
Right. Talk to people with different perspectives. Read books that challenge your worldview.
Be open to learning from your mistakes.
Exactly. The more you expand your mental model of the world.
The better equipped you'll be to make sound decisions.
I like that.
So we've covered motivation, teamwork-focused decision-making.
What else is there?
Well, what about creativity?
Ah, the aha moment.
Exactly. How can we unlock our creative potential?
Like both individually and as a team.
Right. It's about going beyond the tried and true,
Venturing into uncharted territory.
Exactly. And embracing the unknown.
One of the sources you shared told the story of the making of Frozen.
The Disney movie.
Uh-huh. And it turns out their creative process was anything but smooth.
Really?
They struggled for months to come up with a good ending.
You'd think a studio like Disney would have it all figured out.
You would. But they went through tons of revisions and discarded ideas.
So what was the problem?
Well, they had a lot of creative disturbances, as the research called them.
What does that mean?
The directors were constantly pushing each other, challenging assumptions, and bringing in new perspectives.
So it created some friction.
It did, but it also led to some breakthroughs.
Because they were forced to think outside the box.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
The research drew a parallel to this ecological principle called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis.
The what?
The intermediate disturbance hypothesis.
Oh.
It basically says that biodiversity thrives in ecosystems that experience occasional shakeups.
So like a forest fire.
Yeah. Or a fallen tree, creating an opening for new species to grow.
So a little bit of chaos can be a good thing.
For ecosystems and for creative teams.
Too much stability can lead to stagnation.
But too much disruption can be overwhelming.
Right. So it's about finding that sweet spot.
That intermediate disturbance that forces us to adapt and innovate.
I like that.
So the takeaway for all of us.
Don't be afraid to shake things up.
Exactly.
Oh.
Embrace the right amount of chaos, challenge your assumptions, and see what happens.
You never know what brilliant ideas might be lurking just outside your comfort zone.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, so we've covered a lot today.
We have motivation, teamwork focus, decision-making, creativity.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. But there's one more piece of the productivity puzzle.
What's that?
How we manage and use information.
Taking all those great ideas and putting them into practice. One of the most surprising stories I found was about Cincinnati public schools.
What about them?
Well, they were facing this huge challenge.
What was it?
Struggling students.
Yeah.
Tons of data-limited resources.
The
You know.
usual problems.
Yeah. But instead of just throwing more money at the problem.
Or trying to find some fancy tech solution.
Right. They decided to try something completely different.
What did they do?
They changed how teachers interacted with data.
How so?
They created these data rooms.
What are data rooms?
They're basically rooms where teachers were required to spend hours analyzing student performance.
Doing what?
Transcribing test scores onto index cards, creating color-coded piles based on different metrics.
That sounds incredibly tedious.
It was, but that's the point.
I don't get it.
It's the power of disfluency.
Disfluency.
By making the data harder to process.
They actually made it more meaningful.
Exactly. The teachers weren't just passively consuming it.
They were actively engaging with it.
Right, making connections and drawing insights.
And what were the results?
Amazing students' test scores doubled in just 8 months.
Wow. That's incredible.
And the teachers were more energized and engaged.
All because they were forced to slow down and really think about the data.
Exactly. It's counterintuitive, but it worked.
So sometimes the simplest solutions are the best.
Sometimes. And this applies to all of us, not just teachers.
How so?
Well, when you want to really learn from information,
Don't just passively consume it.
right, do something with it.
What?
Summarize it, explain it to a friend, create a visual representation.
Or use it in an experiment.
Exactly. The key is to make it disfluent.
I like that.
So this deep dive has shown you that productivity isn't just about working harder.
It's about working smarter.
Exactly. It's about understanding those subtle forces that shape our motivation, focus, and decision-making.
And it's about finding those overlooked choices.
The ones that can unlock our full potential.
I think that's a great place to wrap things up.
It is. So keep exploring, keep experimenting, and keep pushing yourself to be better.
In everything you do.
That's what this deep dive is all about.